morning. I'm Jim, and this is the Film Experience. Welcome. We're here at the CN Rail Station in Fort Langley, British Columbia, and I'm out today with a beautiful old camera. It is a Kodak Vigilant, the model 620 from, they were produced from 1939 to 1949. It's a 6x9 format. Beautiful camera for doing very wide format pictures. And I've got it loaded with film already. I'm actually going to take you back into the studio here and we'll take a look at the process of loading the film. I don't want to be doing it out here in the daylight. So I'm going to load the camera up with this Cana-Pan film, which is a 220 format. This one's ASA 160 and it expired in August 1970. So let's load it up. Drop the film in place and stretch it across. And I'm going to advance it just till I see the arrow. Close it up. And then open the window, and we're going to turn until we see the first frame. Watch it closely because it's so easy to go past and there's no way to go back. So we'll start seeing some dots eventually as I advance. Here we go, there's an arrow, a couple arrows, there's the dots, and at the end of the dots will be a 1. That's my first frame. I'm going to close the little shutter, and we are ready to go shoot some film. Okay, so the camera's loaded, and as I showed you, it's loaded with film that expired 53 years ago. So not sure what we're going to get today. We'll take a look, see what happens. But let's take a look at the camera. So the camera is a folder. It has a button here on the side to release the front plate and bellows, and that pops out. It's got focus on the front, and for most of my work today, I'm going to leave it at pretty much at infinity. Down on the bottom, it has lens apertures of 4.5 to f/22. Now, there are different versions of this camera and different lenses. So over the 10 years that they made them, there was a number of different varieties. So if you have a Vigilant, you may not have exactly the same settings as I do. The shutter speeds range from bulb and time all the way up to a 200th of a second. And on the side, if I pop this out, we have a little viewfinder that can be used in portrait or in landscape format. And what's kind of unique with this particular version is the fact that it actually has parallax correction. Not sure if you can see that. Little dial on the viewfinder, so that without that, normally as you get closer, because the distance between the viewfinder and the lens is they're not in exactly the same position. It's not like we're seeing through the lens. So as you get closer, those images get out of alignment. This little dial allows you to shift the view, so I can actually dial in and say I'm taking a photo at something that is a meter away. And it will adjust so that when I look through the viewfinder, I am seeing pretty much what I'm going to get through the lens. It also has a very cool little waist level viewfinder right here on the top. And I'm not sure how well you can see that on here, but it allows me to look down, produces a very tiny little image, but lets me roughly compose my photo. And if I'm shooting landscape, I can also rotate that up onto the side so that I'm getting a landscape view. So it's a very simple camera, totally manual, and the way it works is to compose your shot. You set your shutter, your aperture. I'm going to set mine at f11. I've taken a meter reading on the environment, and that's pretty much what I'm going to be shooting today. And I'm going to be shooting at 1/50th of a second. So to take the picture, all I do is on the top I have the little shutter lever. I cock the shutter, and then I compose my my image through the viewfinder. And once I've got the image, whether it be portrait or horizontal, and then I push the shutter, and it will release the shutter cocking on the lens. Click. And then I will have to remember to manually advance my film. You remember in the studio when I showed you loading the camera, we advance it to 1. I have to remember to advance it now till I see the number 2. And then I'm ready to take my next shot. If you forget to do that, you will produce a multiple exposure. And I also want to cover that shutter window. Ideally, I only want to look at that shutter window in the darkness, or not necessarily in darkness, but maybe in shade, or at least cover it up, just avoid direct light getting into that little film counter window. So that's the Kodak variant. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to wander around the village. I'm going to take a few pictures, and then once we've got them, we'll go back into the darkroom, we'll process them, and see just how this 53-year-old film turned out. See F8 for this one. Okay, so that is frame number 8. So on a roll of film, being a 6x9 format camera, the maximum number of frames I will get is 8. So I've shot my 8th. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to open a little window on the back, and I'm going to advance my film all the way so that it's completely taken up onto the take-up spool. And that should do it. Camera's closed up. So at this point, I'm not going to take the film out. It's not a great idea to do that in bright daylight. So I'm going to leave that. We'll take care of that when we get back to the studio. And that's where we're going to head now. We'll go back, we'll take the film out, and we'll take a look, get it processed, and see how well this 53-year-old film has done. Not to mention the 84-year-old camera. So we're back in the darkroom, and to take the film out of the camera, it's quite easy. So I've got it fully rewound so that it's all on the take-up spool. So I can now safely go ahead and open the camera. Just slide the latch, pop it open, and there's our roll. I go ahead and take that out, and that is now ready to be processed. So now we have our film from the camera. And before I get into developing, let's talk a little bit about the film itself. So the Cana-Pan film, it has an expiry date of August 1970. And when it was still current film, it was rated at 160 ISO. Here we are 53 years later shooting it. It's no longer 160 ISO. What happens is film over time, it loses some sensitivity. So there's an old standby rule of thumb to when you're shooting expired film is to increase the exposure by 1 stop for every decade. So in this case we've got 5 decades. So if we're going to do that, so the film is rated at 160 ISO. So if we go one stop, we take it to 80. One more stop, we take it to 40. One more stop, we take it to 20. Then 10, then 5. So that's 5 stops. Now, we could go out and shoot this film at a rating of 5 ISO. But I'd have to be shooting it on a tripod because we'd be talking about really slow shutter speeds. I'm going to be hand holding this. So I did hand hold this, so I needed faster speeds. So instead, what I did was I didn't quite go all the way a full 5 stops. I went down 3 stops to 20, or more specifically, 25 ISO, because that's a reading that I could select on my meter. So I've shot it at 25 ISO. But Jim, what do we do with the fact that it's still going to be underexposed? Well, what I'm going to do is in processing, I'm going to develop it, but I'm going to push the developing time. I'm going to extend the developing time by a couple of minutes to help to compensate for that difference. So what do we do about developing? So we've got this roll of film. What do we do about it? How do we deal with it? We could possibly take it to a lab. Maybe. You'll probably find that most labs, you walk in, you put this on the counter, they're going to look at it and go, what is this? They're not familiar with 220 formats. They're not going to want to put it in with all of the current films. So you might be able to go to a lab and get some custom processing. So that's an option. You'd have to talk to the lab. Simplest way is home developing it. So just using normal black and white chemistry, you can most likely develop it. Now, which developer did I use? Well, my normal developer that I use is Ilford Ilfosol 3. Wonderful developer, nice fine-grained developer, but it's not terribly contrasty. That's really good when you're for processing in a darkroom, where you're going to use contrast filters to adjust the contrast level. It allows you start off with a flatter original image and then adjust contrast during processing. Also, if you're going to scan or digitize your film, it's good to start off with a slightly flatter negative and then adjust the contrast again in digital processing. But in this case, we've got negatives that are going to be rather faint because of the age of the film. We really want to punch that. We want to increase the contrast in developing. So for that purpose, I used a developer called Rodinal. Rodinal is one of the oldest developers on the planet, and it's been around for a very long time, and it works with pretty much any black and white film. It is a high contrast developer, which is going to help with this film. It's going to boost that contrast up. And another advantage of Rodinal is that it is readily available to me. I can go to my local camera shop that's 5 minutes from my home and pick up a bottle of Rodinal. Now, as I said, my normal developer is Ilfosol, which means I don't go through Rodinal very much. I do it with specialized films, sometimes the large format films, but otherwise it just tends to sit. And with most developers, that's a problem. They deteriorate over time. They have a relatively short shelf life. There's an old saying with Rodinal. The shelf life of Rodinal is longer than the life of the shelf on which it's sitting. You can have a bottle of Rodinal on your shelf and not use it for 10 years and it's fine. I have actually used a bottle of Rodinal that was 60 years old just to try it out, and it worked fine. So that's another nice thing with Rodinal. If it sits around, that's okay. It doesn't degrade. Now, one of the downsides with Rodinal is it's not a fine-grained developer. But in this case, I'm talking 53-year-old film. I'm not going to be expecting images that are gallery quality. I just want to see if I can get something off this film. So I'm fine with having my pictures a little bit grainier. So that's what I did with developing. Next thing we're going to do, let's take a look at the actual pictures, see what we got off the film. Well, those were the shots. Nothing too exciting. It was just a test roll after all. You never want to shoot anything important on vintage film because it's always a gamble. But that's part of the fun. I was actually pleased with the results. They turned out better than I had expected. Now the photos were not as sharp as I would normally like, but that's partly due to the developer I chose to use, and most certainly the age of the film. I've had several responses from people saying they were surprised I was able to get anything at all. I fully expected to get photos. I've been able to recover photos off much older film. In fact, I recently recovered photos that were shot in 1926. If you want to see that story, I'll link to it below. Black and white film is especially stable and can give decent images even when it's quite old. And this is one of the cool things about film. Think about it. Will we be able to recover photos from digital media after 50 years? Well, do you remember compact flash cards from the 90s? How about zip drives and floppy drives? Can you use them today? I don't think so. Yet we can still recover images from film more than 100 years old. The Kodak Vigilant is a fun old camera to use. There were a lot of them made, so they can be found quite inexpensively. If you're looking for one, check the lens, check the shutter, and check the bellows closely before buying if at all possible. I was lucky to find this one in pristine condition. Well, that concludes this episode of The Film Experience. I hope you found it interesting. Please consider liking and subscribe. We have some interesting episodes coming up, including using a 150-year-old field camera on a busy street on a weekend.